Welcome back everybody, my name is Philip and today we'll talk about ISO or ISO, a setting of your camera. Note that this particular video right now is part 3 of a 3 video series where I talk about the big 3, which is aperture, shutter speed and ISO. And these 3 videos in turn, they belong to a very elaborate and detailed article that I have composed over at letsimage.com, where I sort of lie down all the resources that came to my mind to explain you how to use these 3 functions or features of your camera to get the most out of it and to actually sort of magnify the options available to you when it comes to your own creative photo taking. So in this video, we're going to talk about ISO and I'm going to give it a quick rundown. And as I mentioned, if you want to have detailed information with more examples and things like that, just head over to the link that is down in the description and have a read through the article. And after which you're going to be good to go get out there and make use of the ISO setting or aperture or shutter speed and even the manual mode, which I have sort of attacked on the website a little bit as well. So first thing we want to do is we want to understand what the hell is ISO or ISO. Let's just call it ISO because it sounds nicer, sounds like a name. What is it? Why would you care about it? And where can you find it on your camera? And then why would you use it in general? You know what I mean? So let's talk about what the ISO setting actually is. Now, compared to the other 2 videos where I talked about aperture and the shutter speed, the ISO setting is a setting. It's not a camera mode. And this ISO setting is just available for you to be changed at your liking. Now remember, maybe in the first and second video I talked about the camera sensor, which is the part of the camera that essentially collects the light, transforms it into an image, and then the image is being saved on your camera. Now this sensor, and here is where I'm going to make things a little bit simple, just because otherwise it's just super difficult to understand. This sensor has a certain sensibility to light. And the cool thing is you can decide if you want to have the sensor to be more or less sensitive to light. Note that this is just half of the truth, because essentially the sensor has a set sensibility to light, and the only thing that changes is the gain that is being applied to the image. Now that is incredibly difficult to understand if you're trying to understand what ISO is, so I'm going to stick with the most commonly accepted example of changing the sensitivity of the sensor to light, essentially. So what you can do is you can tell your sensor, be not very sensitive to light, right? So it's going to need a little more light to take the picture, or be very sensitive to light. So even just a little bit of light will be enough to take a picture. Okay, so this is the simple fact of the ISO setting or ISO setting of your camera. The more sensitive the sensor is to light, the less light it needs to take a picture. The less sensitive, the more light it requires, okay? And this is also expressed with very simple numbers. So let's talk about where can you find this on your camera, and then why would you care about it in the first place? So if you have a look at your camera screen, you want to find something that looks very similar to this particular image right here, which is taken off of my screen of my Sony cam. Now on yours, it might be on the top of your camera or somewhere else, but just have a look in your manual. You should be able to find it quite quickly. Now this particular ISO or ISO setting goes with most cameras from 50 up to an extremely high number. Something like 250,000 or something ridiculous like that, which you normally will never have to care about because you never reach that number anyway. And I'll explain in a second why. So most cameras, at least most beginner or let's say entry-level cameras, and even most of the mid-range cameras, they start at an ISO of 100. Let's just say this is the base ISO. At this point, the sensor is the least sensitive to light. Okay, if you use the base of the camera, which is the lowest value you can change that ISO or ISO setting to, then you have the base value, and this is the least sensitive the sensor can be to light. So when it comes to this particular setting, it will require the most light to take a picture. That's cool because you have other options to control how much light reaches the sensor. You have the aperture and you have the shutter speed, which I talked about in previous videos. So under normal circumstances over the day, for example, that's totally cool. Now, let's just say it's getting darker and there is less light available outside, but you still want to take pictures handheld. So you want to walk around literally, hopefully with a lens on your camera, and you want to take a couple of pictures, but it's getting so dark that the aperture and the shutter speed can't handle it alone, right? The pictures come out far too dark for whatever reason. So we need to do something. So what you can do is you can simply change your ISO setting. If you increase the ISO setting, then your sensor becomes more sensitive to light, right? So in essence, if you, for instance, go from 100 to, I'm making up a random number, 800, for example, then you will have made your sensor way more sensitive to light, so it can use less light that's there to take a picture. Now, wait a second, this sounds a little bit too weird, because that means if I just crank up my ISO, let's say to 56,000 or something like that, or 65,000 or whatever the value is, then I can just theoretically walk through the night and take pictures. Is that actually it? Like, there are no consequences? Wrong. There are a couple of consequences, and let me tell you what it is. If you change your ISO value or ISO value from, let's say, 100 to 256,000, then yeah, you might be able to walk through the streets at night and take handheld pictures without them being blurry or too dark. Now, the negative side effect is that if you have a very high ISO, and that depends a bit on your camera, the higher you go with your ISO, the more noise you will introduce to your images. And noise, as you surely have seen, if you take, for example, your iPhone and you shoot into the dark, then you'll see it just looks grainy, right? And this grain is called noise, and it's a big hatred part in photography. I hate it, but mostly you can get rid of it. But the point is, with a high ISO, you will get noise in your images. So there has to be a little bit of a trade-off, but then why would you ever increase it? Why would you just always leave it down? I'm just going to give you a quick example of myself when I was walking through London to take this picture right here. It was obviously very dark on the streets, and I did not have the chance to put out a tripod or whatever, because I just saw the guy essentially spitting fire on the side of the road somewhere. Now, the problem was I had to react fast. So the only thing I could do to take a handheld shot is to boost up that ISO like mad after I took care of the aperture and the shutter speed. So once I did that, I was able to have the picture. I kind of froze the motion as fast as possible, and I was very happy with it, but I did have noise. Now, in my case, it was not too much noise, and I was able to get rid of it, but this is the kind of trade-off that you have. You can go with very high ISO, but then you will have noise. But if you can remove it later, that's normally fine. So my suggestion would be just to simply go into any camera mode that's not auto, so something like aperture priority, shutter priority, or even manual if you think you're ready for it, and just change your ISO settings, right? And just try to take a couple of pictures to see how high with your camera can you get at night, for example, to not get too much noise into your images. Once you have figured it out, you should be good to go, and you know exactly when you can increase the ISO and when you shouldn't increase the ISO, because it's going to screw up your image. Now, let's give it a quick recap. In simple terms, the ISO setting simply says how sensitive is your sensor to light. If you have a very low ISO setting, something like 100 that most cameras start out with, or many at least, then you have the least sensitivity to light of the sensor, so the sensor will require more light. If you crank up the ISO to something like 256,000, then you will have a very increased sensitivity of light to the sensor, to light of the sensor. Your sensor will be more sensitive to light, and you can take pictures, for instance, in darker environments if necessary. Now, this should be all that is necessary to get you going with the ISO setting and get you to actually experiment a little bit to see what you can do. Like, how high can you crank it up? What can it do, for example, for you when you go into dark environments? Things like that. Just change it and see what happens to your images. If you want to have some more examples, or also examples when it comes to the manual mode, for instance, which would be the next step on the photographer's journey if you want, then don't worry or don't hesitate to head down to the link in the description that brings you over to the full article where I talk about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, as well as the manual mode of your camera. Other than that, I hope you did like the video. If you did like the video, do not forget to hit the thumbs up button, and also, if you're new, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, as it's going to help out me. As it's going to help me out a lot. Other than that, happy experimenting with your camera, happy aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and manual experimenting now that you're done with this 3-video mini-series, and I hope to see you the next time in about a couple of days, because I'm pumping out videos every single week. Until then, happy shooting, and I'll see you then.